something that really stuck with me after I watched Citizen Kane, and something that I always keep in the back of my mind when I'm doing these videos, is the idea that you can know just about everything about someone. You can know about their actions, the things they've said, the things that they've done, where they come from, what the main events of their life are, and yet they can still be very mysterious to you. That was, if you haven't seen the movie Citizen Kane, it follows the life of Charles Foster Kane, and we get to see all the major events in his life from his childhood to his death. And at the end of the movie, we're left with really no better idea of who he was as a man after we've seen all of this stuff. He's still a mystery. If anything, it just makes him a bigger mystery. We still don't really get what he personally believed, what made him tick, what was the man underneath all the stuff that we looked at. And I think to a certain extent we have this with Tony Soprano. When you're trying to do an analysis of someone, oftentimes the issue is there's not enough information to go on. Some characters I just don't really do an analysis on because the show's not that long, or they don't get that much screen time, or there's not that much background, and I can't really get a good measure of what made the person the way they are. With Tony, we kind of have the opposite problem, where we just kind of have too much information. We have 6 seasons of Tony, with him being the main character. And on top of that, we also have the dreams that reveal his subconscious and the conversations with his psychiatrist, where he talks about his thoughts and he narrates his life a bit. Even so, though, I do feel we don't always we don't get a real picture of what Tony actually thinks. We get some snippets of it, but it's hard to tell how he actually sees the world. We get all these kind of bits and pieces of it, and we know all this stuff about Tony, but can we really say that we know him as a person? Now, I'm doing this as of watching the 3rd season of The Sopranos. I thought this would be a good time to do a character profile, because my understanding is Tony goes through a massive negative character arc in the latter seasons, and this was a good point, I think, with just all the stuff that I've seen so far to kind of talk about him. Now, there's a billion videos on this, but I'm going to do my best to try to have a different, unique take. So watching The Sopranos, the question that really keeps going in the back of my head is, what is Tony's fundamental nature? Is he a bad man who's well socialized into being somewhat good in some aspects of his life? Is he just a complicated person who has good and bad qualities? Is he a fundamentally good person who his potential was ruined because of the dysfunctional household and the environment that he was brought up in? I think it's very hard to tell, and I think the show does this on purpose, and that's one of the reasons why it's so good. Like, I find they try very hard to balance Tony's negative and positive traits. Whenever he does something nice, or he connects with his children or his wife, or he otherwise kind of shows some humanity, I feel it'll often maybe go a couple of episodes where you're really starting to like Tony and you're sympathizing with him and you're viewing him as the hero. And then he just does something crazy or violent or selfish or something to remind you that, no, he's still a mob boss. He's still a criminal. He's still a scumbag in a lot of ways. Fundamentally, I think it comes down to the age-old question of nature versus nurture. Are people blank slates? Are they tabula rasa? Is there not that much to begin with regards to their genes, with their predispositions, with perhaps their soul or their spirit, or who they fundamentally are, absent all external factors? Or are they more a product of that? Are genes deterministic? Is your parents decide, even if you aren't raised by them, how you're going to live your life? Are some people just born evil, or some people born good, or some people born somewhere in between? And this has been one of kind of the oldest debates in psychology, but just in terms of morality and in human behavior in general. Whenever you see someone who's a psychopath, oftentimes it's not very clear. They come from a dysfunctional household. They maybe were abused or sexually molested as a child. but they also will come from a family with that sort of genetic trait, or they'll just fundamentally be that kind of person. They have some sort of mental illness. They just are born a sociopath with no ability to empathize with others. And it's very hard to tell. There's also the question of free will that often gets overlooked in these contexts. Can people actively, through force of will, choose who they're going to be? Can they change themselves? Can people even change? These are all these different questions, and I think they're all very well wrapped up within the character of Tony Soprano, which makes him such a good character, because it's very difficult to kind of get a grasp on what's nature, what's nurture, what are his personal choices, what's fate, what's random chance. So I think first, and there's a couple different interpretations, and I'm going to go through them for the bulk of this character profile. Now, the first one, and probably the most obvious one, and the one that his psychiatrist, I should say, tends to adhere to, is the idea that Tony is a fundamentally good person, or he has a good heart, and a lot of the horrible things he does, his anger, his disregard for human life, his greed, these things are a product of being raised in a dysfunctional family environment where both of his parents were both abusive and neglectful. His mother is completely out of her mind. She constantly gaslights him, constantly manipulates him. He was raised around all of these guys who were career criminals, who killed people, who sold drugs, and he was kind of pushed into this life. So you could say that, and I think in a future episode we get to see this, what could have been. If Tony had been born to a more normal Italian family, how might his life have gone? Might he have been a respectable and productive member of society? I mean, the man is smart. Even if he's not the most book smart person in the world, he's very charming. He's extremely charismatic. He's good at getting deals. He could have become a very powerful and wealthy businessman. He could have been a big sales guy. He has good organizational skills. Tony has a lot of talents that he could have brought to a legitimate career. So I guess kind of the first theory of how Tony turned out and what Tony is that he's a product of his environment. That he might have some of these traits, his intelligence, his charisma, and things like that, but fundamentally he was a blank slate, and he's a combination of the best and worst aspects of his mother, his father, of Junior, and of all the mobsters around him. And these best and worst aspects kind of exist in an uneven balance. And as the series goes on and more messed up stuff happens, the nurture side pushes him more and more into one direction. So I think that's one way that you can look at Tony. I think that's kind of the most, the simplest way to kind of look at him. And there is a lot of evidence for that. Like, Tony does do a lot of admirable or good things with his family, with taking care of his friends. The fact that he even has friends. He does look out for people. He does go to visit people when they're sick and stuff like that. I mean, Tony has a lot of good characteristics that are, compared to a lot of characters who are more just complete psychos and can't even dress themselves and are just bloodthirsty murderers. Tony is much more calm, collected, and rational. So that's theory number one. Theory number two is that Tony was born, what's the old expression? You're born with two wolves inside of you. The one wins that you feed more. That Tony was born with these two kind of conflicting natures that are very balanced within him, in which he has all these bad traits, his anger, his greed, his selfishness, but at the same time he has a lot of good traits. He has his charisma, he has his ability to form friendships with people, his ability to inspire others. You could argue he does love his family at a fundamental level. He even loves his mother and Uncle Junior, despite the fact that they try to have him whacked. And there are times he feels sorry for animals, or when that one girl gets killed by Ralph, he gets really pissed off about that. And you can kind of see the war between these two sides of Tony's personality as you go through the series. And I guess in this kind of interpretation, free will plays a much bigger factor. Wherein something I have noticed pretty consistently with Tony's therapy is that he never really makes any effort to change. And I think I've read ahead and looked at some of the spoilers, and I think this is what Dr. Melfi eventually figures out, is that all Tony's really taking away from it is how to be a better criminal, how to utilize better, deal with interpersonal relationships to get what he wants, how to square the circle in his mind mentally as a way to get rid of his guilt. That fundamentally he never really tries to improve himself. And the few times he does kind of make an effort to spend more time with his kids, or to stop seeing some of his mistresses, or to otherwise try to be a better man, they're very, very quickly abandoned. I think, as they said, as Dr. Melfi said, he's someone who needs to constantly be in action, who doesn't like to be too retrospective, to think about it. So I just don't think, if he's predisposed, I think, to not trying to make changes in his life. But I think there's just no genuine desire within him to change. And as time goes on, whatever aspects of his character, his better nature, that are driving him and did make him more of a balanced person, or maybe more of a unbalanced person who kind of swung between two extremes, there's a definitive corrosive effect. And that's the thing to keep in mind about the nature of sin, is that fundamentally sin is a very corrosive effect. It damages the soul, it damages the psyche, it damages the spirit. Every time he commits adultery, he kills someone in anger, he sells drugs, he does whatever the evil things Tony Soprano does that corrodes the soul. And it's not necessarily a one for one. You can't just do something really bad and then try to balance it out by doing something good. And we can see that Tony does try to do this. Like, generally speaking, with money, whenever he thinks that he's guilty, he normally offers money to try to make it right, or he buys them a present or something like that. And that tends to be the way that he deals with other people. He kind of views it as a business transactional thing, where he's paying off his guilt. But being occasionally concerned or giving money or stuff like that, it heals your soul a bit, but the sheer amount of damage that he inflicts on it on a daily basis eventually wears you down. And it's kind of a vicious cycle, because the more you're worn down, the less resistance you have to that kind of behavior, and the more you engage in it, and then you really spiral downhill. And you can see this with a lot of characters in The Sopranos, particularly the gambling addicts, wherein they feed their addiction to gambling. It keeps getting worse and worse and worse. They become less able to resist it, and they just wind up becoming just complete degenerates who are slave to their passions, who will just like do anything. They'll sell their family into slavery just for one more roll of the die. But yeah, like I said, I do find that really interesting. And if there's anything I can really criticize about Dr. Melfi as a psychiatrist, is she seems to be very focused on trying to get to Tony's ideas. And I guess she does, in her defense, try to send him to behavior modification. But she does seem kind of scared of him, understandably so. So she won't normally, I find, push him very much. And I don't think she calls him hard enough on his nonsense and things like that. And part of that is, I think she's just intimidated, because if anyone calls Tony on anything, he just freaks out and goes into a violent rage. So a lot of his reaction is, a lot of his visits there is just basically to stroke his ego. At least that's the impression that I get. It's to deal with his stress. But I don't think that Tony ever really entered into therapy to try to become a better person or to try to resolve his issues. I think, once again, it's very transactional. It's very much, I want to go to therapy so I don't have panic attacks as often. which it ultimately does do. But beyond that, it doesn't make him a better person. It just makes him a better criminal. So that's kind of the second theory, that Tony was kind of a mixed bag. The bad choices that he made, the inability of his will to control his passions, sent him down the road to destruction and made him worse and worse as the show went on. Now, the third interpretation, which I think is the most interesting one and the one I've been kind of waiting to get to, is the idea that it's Tony's nature is evil, but nurture in this case was a good thing. Now, in a lot of cases, particularly in modern society, whether it's people on the left or right, we tend to hate the entire idea of socialization. The idea that society specifically trains us and codes us and teaches us to act in a certain way. I know the new atheists were very much into this, the whole idea, oh, you were raised religious, that's why you believe it. You were raised with these specific values and these specific ideas and these specific beliefs, and you don't legitimately hold them. You have false consciousness that makes you kind of embody them or respect them or whatever, but they're not your actual opinions. And you should feel resentment towards society for forcing you to think and act a certain way. And once again, that tends to be, and I certainly am guilty of talking about this a lot, and people on the left and right and center and whoever will often do this and complain about socialization and talk about individualism and stuff like that. But sort of like with like the police and some other institutions, it's not necessarily for you if you're someone who can't entirely understand it. Like, in my personal view, a certain percentage of people are born good. A certain percentage of people are born fundamentally evil. The majority of people, however, are just very much blank slates and can be influenced in whatever direction the wind blows or whatever they're told. And it is very necessary to have these social institutions, to imprint them on people as a way of them controlling themselves, in a way of allowing us to function. And to a certain degree, as cynical as it is, having function within a society is kind of a good in and of itself. So what do I mean by that? So within the context of this kind of interpretation of Tony's character, he was born an evil person. He was born greedy, psychopathic, unable to really empathize truly with others, violent, unwilling to really respect the rights or feelings of others. Everything was just kind of about him. And I think in his case, you could argue that society, large to at least a certain degree, worked. It did put certain principles in his head that, at least for a lot of the series, act to restrain him. Like things about hurting women, maybe, the traditional family structure, trying in his own bad way to be a father who's there for his kids, the idea that he has to be a provider, the idea that you should try to avoid hitting civilians. I mean, the mafia code, what he's not really, I don't think Tony really believes in God, but what he got from his religion and his kind of family, I think have given him a certain degree of values and morals, even if he's inherently an amoral person who doesn't really feel it deep down. They've been programmed into him, and that programming acts as a very necessary restraint on his actions. So under this interpretation, I don't know if Tony actually does feel guilty, or it's just there's a certain degree of cognitive dissonance between how he feels and what he wants to do and what's kind of been programmed into him. And as someone with bipolar disorder, wherein my mood is often not related at all to what's actually going on, I think I understand very well what it's like. And a lot of the time when Tony expresses things, he expresses it in terms like, oh, well, a good son's supposed to love his mother. It's my duty. It's my duty to have kids and to be there for them and stuff like that. And it seems like he often sees things in that way, that that's just what he's supposed to do. But he doesn't necessarily have any emotional attachment to it. It reminded me, there's a guy I know who is a diagnosed psychopath, but he's a very pleasant and respectable member of society because he's a believing Catholic, and he thinks he's going to go to hell if he acts on his impulses. So in that case, the socialization, the fear, the whatever is doing its job from a utilitarian perspective. He would, that fear, that thing that's programmed into him. I mean, he became a Catholic later in life, but you get what I'm saying. That holds him back and makes someone who would probably naturally be a fairly evil person, a fairly productive and pleasant person to be around. So I kind of feel that way a bit about Tony, wherein the guilt or whatever he seems to feel, I'm not sure if he's actually feeling it, or it could even be what I've gone through, where it's guilt for not being guilty, if that makes sense, that you're not adhering to what would a normal person would feel in this situation. So like I said, I'm bipolar. If I'm manic and something really bad happens, or I have hypomania, but you get the idea, then my reaction might be really weird to it. I might just start laughing or something like that, even if it's not funny. Likewise, if I'm depressed, I just view everything in the most negative way possible. And it's just a fundamental disconnect between your emotions and what's happening around you. And it does lead to a lot of emotional stress. It leads to kind of derealization, depersonalization. You kind of feel like you're outside of your body looking in at yourself because your emotions don't really make sense. And so when I'm like that, oftentimes and I'm better now because I take medication for it, but the programming that society has given me will kick in. Regardless of whatever crazy thing I'm thinking about when I'm hypomanic or that I want to do when I'm depressed, the programming that's been put in place in me prevents me from doing that, even if I don't necessarily emotionally feel like that at the time. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I've never tried to kill myself despite being suicidal for most of my life, because I was taught as a kid that it's wrong. It's morally wrong. It's a sin. Even when I wasn't I was agnostic or whatever, I still thought that it was inherently wrong, and that it would hurt my parents, and that, a good son's supposed to love his parents. A good son is supposed to make them proud. And I just, even if I wanted to off myself, I could never do that to my parents. And even when I felt like killing myself and stuff like that, that programming there, that socialization, that way I was brought up and taught, just kicked in, and it kind of saved me. And this can be a bad thing in a lot of ways, but I think it can also be a good thing in a lot of ways. Wherein if you're predisposed to certain negative behaviors, or you're just not sure what to do, then social norms kick in. And if they're good social norms, they help you to act in a proper fashion. So what I'm saying is, I think a lot of the time Tony does things or sees things and he just reacts because that's the way he's kind of programmed to react. Like not hurting kids, his views about rape and women and stuff like that. Just some of his more chivalrous aspects, how he cares about his family. I do wonder if those are actual emotions Tony has, or if it's just the way he was raised in an Italian American environment where family's everything, and a certain code of honor and ethics and stuff like that. And that's just kicking in. And I almost feel like sometimes I get the impression that he feels guilt because he doesn't feel guilty, like that he just witnessed something really screwed up. I think that's largely, that actually is canon. That's what happened when he, I forget the guy's name, but that it's where his father cut off the finger of that butcher guy, and they took his butcher shop, the one that Tony also meets in. And he said as a kid it should have traumatized him, it should have filled him with disgust, but he was into it. It gave him a rush. He felt powerful. He lived vicariously through it. But he also knew that he shouldn't, that that's wrong, that that's not what a respectable member of society is supposed to do. And that's one of the initial causes of his panic attacks. So maybe my theory has a bit more grounding in the actual show than just speculation. That a lot of his panic attacks, a lot of his issues come from the fact that his natural inclinations are kind of straining against the programming that's been placed on him by society. So those are, I think, just a couple ways to try to interpret Tony Soprano. It's very hard for me to get any kind of grasp of how Tony actually views the world. The few times we really get him to explain it, it's really messed up. He has all kinds of excuses and stuff like that. But once again, I don't know if that's even necessarily what he thinks, or if his narcissism means he's trying to come up with an excuse, not for himself, but for the person he's talking to. So it's, like I said, he's a very mysterious character. And it's interesting because we know so much about him. We see him being psychologically analyzed in almost every episode. But like I said, I think a lot of it really comes down to nature versus nurture, and that's kind of at the heart of a lot of The Sopranos. With characters like Chris or Meadow or Tony Jr. or whoever, if things had have gone a bit different from them, maybe they had been raised differently, maybe they had a different father figure, who knows how things could have gone. Could things have turned out a lot better for them? I don't know. But that is, I think, kind of what makes Tony an interesting character. Now, I might do another character profile when I finish the series and I kind of see his descent into madness or whatever. But those are my thoughts on it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't just repeat what everybody else says about Tony. God bless everybody, and more content to come.